Can you imagine you're lying in a hospital bed, just recovered from surgery, and when you get home, the door won't open for you anymore? Not because the lock is broken, but because the person behind that door, the one you gave birth to, raised, and sacrificed your whole life for, has sold your house, signed your name, taken your money, and left you standing on the street with nothing. I'm Marlene Whitaker. I'm 73 years old, and this is the story of how I lost it all, and then got back so much more. If you're reading this far, please like and comment your city name below, so I know how far my story has traveled in this world. And don't leave, because what happens next will be unbelievable. I still remember the exact feeling of that cab door closing behind me. The late October air had that particular bite to it. Not cold enough to hurt, but enough to remind you that things were changing whether you wanted them to or not. I had a single rolling suitcase and a plastic hospital bag with the clothes I'd been wearing the day they wheeled me into surgery. My hip had been replaced. 6 weeks of recovery at my sister Ruth's house in Denton, 2 states away, and now I was finally coming home. I should have felt relieved. I remember looking up at the house from the sidewalk. The old cream-colored colonial with the black shutters I'd repainted myself back in 1998. The 2 oak trees in the front yard that Ethan used to climb as a boy. The rose bushes along the left side of the porch that I had planted the spring after my husband Gerald died. 19 years I had tended those roses. They were still there, a little overgrown, but still mine. Or so I thought. I pulled my suitcase up the front walk, step by careful step, still favoring my right side the way the physical therapist had told me not to. I got to the door and reached into my purse for my keys. I remember the small brass keychain Gerald had given me, a little lighthouse, because he always said I was the kind of woman who helped people find their way home. I slid the key into the lock. It didn't turn. I thought I had the wrong key. I tried again. Nothing. I checked the keychain, confirmed it was the house key, and tried a third time. The key went in smoothly but stopped dead. The lock had been changed. I stood there for a moment, confused more than alarmed. I thought maybe Ethan had upgraded the locks for security and forgotten to send me the new key. He'd done forgetful things before. Missed my birthday once, missed Gerald's memorial twice. But he was my son, and I had long since learned to extend grace where I could. I reached for my phone. The call rang 4 times and went to voicemail. Ethan, honey, it's Mom. I'm standing at the front door and my key isn't working. I think the lock might have been changed. Call me back when you get a chance. I'm a little tired from the drive. I sat on the porch steps and waited. The mail slot was stuffed with envelopes I didn't recognize. Thick, official-looking envelopes addressed not to me, but to someone named Horizon Pacific Holdings, LLC. I stared at that name for a long time. I had never heard of it in my life. 40 minutes passed. The neighbor across the street, Carol Peabody, came out to get her newspaper and stopped when she saw me. She stood on her walkway for a moment without moving, and there was something in her face that I can only describe as the expression of a person who has information they desperately do not want to deliver. She crossed the street slowly. "Marlene," she said, "you're back." "Just got in," I said. "Key's not working. You haven't seen Ethan around, have you?" Carol looked at my suitcase. Then she looked at the house. Then she looked at me with eyes that had gone very sad, very fast, and she said, "Marlene, honey, didn't he tell you?" The cold I had barely noticed before suddenly had teeth. "Tell me what?" I said. Carol sat down next to me on the porch steps, uninvited, unannounced, the way people do when they're about to steady you for a blow. And she said, "The house sold, Marlene, about 3 weeks ago. There were movers here, a whole crew of them. I asked Ethan where you were, and he said you'd decided to move somewhere warmer." She paused. "I thought it was strange, but I didn't. I assumed he had talked to you." I heard the words. I understood each one individually, but my mind kept reassembling them wrong, kept coming up with explanations. There was a mistake. There was a misunderstanding. There was some piece of this I was missing because I had just had surgery and I was tired and people didn't do things like this. Sons didn't do things like this. "Sold," I repeated. "The sign was up maybe a week. Came down fast. Ethan handled everything himself." She touched my hand. Marlene, are you all right? No, I was not all right, but I was not going to fall apart on my own front porch steps of a house that apparently no longer belonged to me. I had lived 73 years on this earth, and I had buried a husband and raised a child alone and paid off a mortgage with my own two hands working as a medical billing supervisor for 31 years. I was not going to dissolve on a Wednesday afternoon in October. I'm fine, I said. Thank you for telling me, Carol. She hovered for a moment longer, offered her guest room, offered her phone, offered coffee. I declined everything. When she finally went back inside, I sat alone on the steps of my former home and stared at the mail slot with the envelopes for Horizon Pacific Holdings, LLC, and I let myself understand, truly understand, what had happened. My son had sold my house while I was recovering from surgery, without asking me, without telling me, without my knowledge or consent. He had taken the house I had spent 40 years paying for, the house I had raised him in, the house his father had died inside, and he had sold it as if it were his to sell. And he had changed the locks before I could come home. I sat there for another hour, not crying, not calling, just sitting very still the way animals go still when they realize the thing they feared has already found them. Then I picked up my suitcase, called a cab, and went to find out exactly what had been done to me. Well, I need to go back a little because you deserve to understand how we got here. You deserve to know that this didn't happen out of nowhere, that there were signs, and that I, like most mothers who love their children too much and too blindly, convinced myself for years that the signs didn't mean what they clearly meant. Ethan was my only child. Gerald and I had tried for more, and it hadn't worked, and eventually we had made our peace with that and poured everything we had into the one remarkable, complicated, occasionally infuriating human being we'd managed to bring into the world. He was bright. He could have done anything. He had Gerald's sharp mind, and God help him, my stubbornness. For a while, when he was young, before the wanting started, before the wanting became needing and the needing became something darker, he was exactly the son I had dreamed of. Then he met Vanessa. I want to be fair here. I want to be the kind of woman who doesn't lay blame at a daughter-in-law's feet for everything her son chooses to do. And the truth is that Ethan had his own weaknesses long before Vanessa came along, but I would be lying if I told you she didn't change him, or maybe she revealed him. I've spent a lot of time in the past 2 years trying to figure out which one it was. Vanessa Pritchard came from money, or rather, she came from the appearance of money, which she had confused with the actual thing so long that she could no longer tell the difference. She was beautiful in the specific way of a person who has spent significant effort constructing her appearance as a weapon. Perfectly highlighted hair, clothes that cost more than my monthly grocery budget, a smile that arrived just slightly too fast and departed in the same way. She was 34 when Ethan brought her home for the first time. He was 37. I had been hoping by then that he might bring home someone settled and kind, someone who wanted a real life. What he brought home instead was someone who wanted the idea of a real life. The dinner parties, the address in the right neighborhood, the financial security, without any of the actual work that built those things. She was polite to me. That was always the part that confused me longest. She was so polite. She asked me about my garden and said the right things and complimented the house in ways that felt, in retrospect, less like admiration and more like appraisal. The house, at that time, was valued at roughly $640,000. That is relevant. Keep that in mind. Ethan and Vanessa married 18 months after they met, in a ceremony that cost $43,000, $20,000 of which Ethan asked me to contribute because he said they were a little tight that month. I contributed. I always contributed. That was who I was. Over the next 4 years, there were other contributions. The down payment for their condo because the area they wanted was competitive. A loan that became a gift because gifts don't cause awkwardness at Christmas. Car payments, travel, medical bills that Vanessa assured me were legitimate and urgent, though I noticed they were always rounded to suspiciously even numbers. I am not a stupid woman. I knew what was happening, but I told myself I was helping. I told myself that this was what parents did, that Gerald would have done the same, and that eventually they would stabilize and it would stop. It did not stop. What stopped instead, was any pretense of subtlety on Vanessa's part. About 2 years before the surgery, things began to shift. The requests became bigger and less apologetic. Ethan started talking about my house differently, not as where his mother lived, but as the property, as the asset, as something that was being underutilized. Vanessa once suggested over dinner that I might be happier in a smaller space. And when I looked at her, she held my gaze without embarrassment. I told them both very calmly that the house was mine and that I intended to remain in it. 3 weeks later, Ethan sat down with me and suggested I consider putting the house in both our names. For my protection, he said, so that if anything happened to me, the transfer of assets would be smooth. He said it with Gerald's exact cadence: calm, reasonable, practical. And for a moment, just a moment, I felt something in my chest loosen. Then I remembered that Gerald would never have asked. I told Ethan no. He didn't push. He changed the subject and asked about my garden, and we ate the rest of the meal pleasantly enough. But something had been revealed in that conversation, the same way Carol's face had revealed something on those porch steps. When you know what you're looking for, you start to see it everywhere. I began, quietly and without announcement, to consult with an estate attorney named Diane Howell. She was a woman around my age, precise and unhurried, who listened to everything I told her and then helped me update my will, establish a living trust, and document my property ownership in ways that were, as she put it, unambiguous and extremely difficult to challenge. I felt better after those meetings. I felt like a woman who had put a good lock on her door. What I didn't account for was that my son had already decided to go through the window. The surgery had been scheduled for 6 weeks before my return. Hip replacement, not emergency, not catastrophic, just the kind of thing that accumulates when you've spent decades on your feet. The orthopedic surgeon had been clear: 6 weeks minimum recovery, preferably not alone. Ruth, my younger sister, had insisted I come to Denton. She had a ranch house with no stairs and 30 years of nursing experience, and the kind of personality that will not accept no for an answer. I told Ethan the timeline. He drove me to Ruth's himself. He carried my bags inside. He hugged me in Ruth's kitchen and said, "Rest up, Mom. We'll take care of everything while you're gone." He said it the way you say things you don't mean, the way you cover over the truth with something that sounds warm until you hold it up to the light. I did not know, standing in my sister's kitchen with a new hip socket still weeks away, that take care of everything meant something specific and monstrous. Ruth told me later that Ethan had called her twice during my recovery. Both times he asked detailed questions about my condition. How mobile was I? Was I on any medication that affected my judgment? When exactly did the doctors expect me to be cleared to travel? Ruth, who is a much more trusting person than I am, answered everything honestly. She thought he was being a concerned son. He was taking notes. During the 4th week of my recovery, while I was doing physical therapy exercises in Ruth's living room and learning to navigate stairs again, Ethan was in Claremont County submitting documents to complete the sale of 4817 Birchwood Drive. The documents included my signature. I had never signed them. The notary whose stamp appeared on the sale papers was a man named Clifton Reeves, who operated a small notary service out of a strip mall in the neighboring county. He was 61 years old, recently divorced, and according to records I would eventually help uncover, had notarized the documents without actually witnessing the signature, a violation of his licensing requirements, and more critically, a crime. Whether he knew the signature was forged or whether he was simply negligent in a way that Ethan exploited was a question that would take months and a separate investigation to answer. But the stamp was there, and the stamp made the documents look legitimate to anyone who didn't look too closely. The real estate transaction closed in 17 days, unusually fast, according to the attorney who eventually reviewed it. The buyer was a property development company called Horizon Pacific Holdings, LLC, based in Nevada, with 2 members of record, an individual named Marcus Trellew and a holding entity with layered corporate registration that pointed, eventually, to a name I recognized: Vanessa's brother, Douglas Pritchard. The sale price was $682,000. Every cent of it was wired to an account in Vanessa's name within 48 hours of closing. Check. I found all of this out in pieces, over the course of 3 days after I arrived back in Claremont. I stayed in a motel the first night. I slept badly and woke at 4 in the morning and lay in the dark adding up the things I knew and the things I didn't. And I made a list on the notepad by the nightstand the way I used to make lists when I was running a department and had too many variables to hold in my head. What I knew: the house had been sold. The lock had been changed. Ethan had not called me back. What I suspected: the signature on the sale documents was not mine. What I needed: to find out if I was right. The next morning I called Diane Howell at 7:45. She was in the office by 8. By 9 I was sitting across her desk, and by 10:30 we had pulled the deed records from the county recorder's office and were looking at my name, Marlene June Whitaker, on a quitclaim deed I had absolutely, categorically never signed. Diane looked at the signature for a long time. Then she looked at me. "This isn't your signature," she said. "No," I said, "it is not." "Marlene," she set the paper down carefully, "do you understand what this means?" "It means my son forged my name," I said, "and sold my house, and I need to know what we're going to do about it." She was quiet for a moment, then she folded her hands on the desk and said, "We're going to do quite a lot about it." I did not call Ethan that day. I know people probably expected that. I know the natural response to what I discovered was to pick up the phone and confront him, to scream, to demand an explanation, to give him the chance to confess or lie or grovel. But I've spent 73 years on this earth, and I have learned one thing with absolute certainty. When a person has shown you what they're willing to do, the worst thing you can do is show them what you know before you're ready. If I called Ethan that day, he would have known I was in Claremont. He would have known I'd found the records. He and Vanessa would have had time to move money, time to construct explanations, time to prepare. I was not going to give them time. So instead, I did something that surprised even me. I called Ruth and told her I needed to stay somewhere else for a while, without explaining exactly why. I called my former colleague, Patricia Okafor, who was one of the sharpest people I had ever worked with, and who happened to be married to a man who did financial forensic accounting. I called my bank and flagged my accounts for monitoring, and then I went back to my motel room, ordered a sandwich from the diner 2 doors down, and began writing down everything I remembered about the past 4 years. Every request, every gift, every loan that became a gift, every conversation about the house. I wrote for 4 hours. When I was done, I had 21 pages. Then I called Diane back and told her I wanted to move as fast as possible, and that I wanted to know what criminal charges could accompany the civil action, and that under no circumstances was anyone to contact Ethan or Vanessa until we were ready to file. "You're sure?" she said. "This is your son, Marlene." "I know who he is," I said. "I also know what he did." There was a pause. Then she said, "All right, let's get to work. I want to tell you something about those first 72 hours, because I think people imagine that a woman my age, in my situation, would have been destroyed, crying in a motel room, begging for her son to explain himself, collapsing under the weight of the betrayal. Maybe some women would have been. I grieved. I won't pretend I didn't. I lay awake 2 nights running and thought about the boy Ethan had been. The 10-year-old who had crawled into my bed during thunderstorms, the 16-year-old who had cried at Gerald's funeral in a way that had broken my heart open, the young man who had once been someone I was proud of. I thought about all the versions of him I had loved. I let myself feel the loss of every single one of them, and then I set the grief aside. Not forever. Grief doesn't work that way, and anyone who tells you different is selling something. But I set it aside with the deliberate intention of a woman who has more important things to do first. Because here is what I knew, and what I want you to understand. I had built something. 40 years of mortgage payments made on time every single month through a recession and a death and a cancer scare and every other thing that life had thrown at me. I had built something, and no one, not my son, not his wife, not a forged signature on a county recorder's document, was going to take it from me without a fight they were not prepared for. I was 73 years old. I had time, and I had nothing left to lose. But by the end of the week, Diane had filed a notice of lis pendens on the property, which meant the new owner, Horizon Pacific Holdings, LLC, controlled in practice by Douglas Pritchard, could not resell or refinance without the lawsuit appearing in any title search. It was the legal equivalent of planting a flag. It said, "This property is disputed." It said, "Someone is coming." Through Patricia's husband, Marcus Chen, I began the slow process of tracing the wire transfer, the $682,000 that had gone into Vanessa's account within 48 hours of closing. The trail was not invisible. Financial trails never truly are, especially when the people who made them were confident they wouldn't be followed. They had been very confident. Patricia told me, after Marcus reviewed the preliminary records, that the transfer pattern suggested Ethan and Vanessa had moved quickly. Too quickly for the kind of careful laundering that would have made things difficult. Money had gone from the sale proceeds into Vanessa's account, then been moved in 3 separate tranches to different accounts over the following week. A luxury vehicle purchase, a wire to a real estate escrow in another county, a series of payments to vendors whose names suggested renovation and furnishings. They had been spending. Of course they had. That was the nature of people like Vanessa Pritchard. She had spent her whole life in the presence of money without the patience to accumulate it, and when a large sum had finally arrived in her account, she had treated it the way a person does when they believe it will keep coming. Lavishly, carelessly, as if the supply were infinite. It was not infinite, and the spending left a paper trail so clear you could have followed it in the dark. The moment I knew with absolute certainty that everything was going to go the way it needed to go. That moment came 9 days after I returned to Claremont. Diane had reached out, through the proper channels, to the notary's licensing board. Clifton Reeves, confronted with the possibility of criminal charges and the permanent revocation of his license, had, within 48 hours, provided a written statement. He had not witnessed the signature. Ethan Whitaker had presented the documents already signed and asked him to notarize them. He had been told that the signer was the owner of record and that she was incapacitated and unable to appear in person. He had asked no further questions because he was, according to his own account, pressed for time and trusted the client. He was, in short, negligent at best and complicit at worst, and he knew it, and he was terrified. And his statement gave us exactly what we needed to move forward. I remember sitting in Diane's office when she told me, and feeling something settle in my chest. Not triumph. Not yet. Not the clean satisfaction of a movie where justice arrives on schedule and everything resolves neatly in the final act. It wasn't like that. It was quieter. More like the feeling of finally being able to put something heavy down after carrying it so long you'd forgotten how much it weighed. "We're ready to file," Diane said. "Then let's file," I said. I thought about the rose bushes on the left side of the porch. 19 years I had tended those roses. I thought about Gerald's little lighthouse keychain sitting in my purse, attached to a key that no longer opened anything. Not yet. But patience is something you earn, and I had earned more of it than Ethan Whitaker had ever imagined. I had raised him. He should have known better. The papers were filed on a Tuesday morning. I was not there when it happened. Diane handled the filing herself, and I had specifically asked not to be present. Not because I was afraid, but because I knew that if I sat in that courthouse and watched my son's name appear on a legal complaint, something in me would crack open that I wasn't ready to deal with yet. I had work to do. I could not afford to crack open. Instead, I was sitting in a corner booth at a diner called Hazel's on the east side of Claremont, eating scrambled eggs I didn't taste, and going through the second pass of Marcus Chen's preliminary financial report. Patricia had dropped it off the night before in a manila folder, the kind without any label on the outside. Discreet in the way that serious things sometimes need to be discreet. I had read it twice already. I was reading it a third time because there were numbers in it that I kept thinking I was misreading, and I wasn't. In the 6 weeks I had been in Denton recovering from surgery, Ethan and Vanessa had spent approximately $214,000. $214,000 in 6 weeks. There was a Mercedes-Benz GLE purchased outright, registered in Vanessa's name. There was a wire to an escrow account for a property in Ashford Heights, a gated community on the north side of the county where the houses started at $900,000 and the neighbors threw parties catered by actual restaurants. There were purchases at stores I recognized by reputation but had never entered, a jewelry boutique downtown, a furniture showroom on Merchants Row that specialized in imported Italian pieces, a home design firm that did what their website called curated interior transformations for a starting fee that was more than I had earned in my best month as department head. They had not been cautious. They had not been quiet. They had, in fact, been so conspicuously, aggressively visible in their spending that two people had already noticed without being asked to look. The first was a woman named Sandra Fitch, who worked in the loan processing department at the credit union Ethan had banked with for 11 years. Sandra was a careful woman, the kind who noticed discrepancies not because she was suspicious by nature, but because she was precise by training. She had flagged the account for review when the wire deposits arrived, not because wire deposits were illegal, but because the amounts and the timing and the pattern were inconsistent with everything she knew about Ethan Whitaker's financial history. Sandra Fitch had not yet contacted anyone official. She didn't know there was anything official to contact, but she had made notes, internal memos, dated and time-stamped. And those notes existed, and when the time came, they would matter enormously. The second person was a real estate agent named Tom Burkett, who had shown Ethan and Vanessa 3 properties in Ashford Heights over the course of a single weekend, 3 weeks after the sale of Birchwood Drive. Tom had noticed because it was his job to notice. The couple's urgency, the way Vanessa spoke about budgets as if they were irrelevant, the cash wire they had sent to hold the property without asking a single question about closing costs or inspection timelines. He had thought at the time that they were simply flush. Newly flush people moved fast, he knew that, but he had kept their file on his desk instead of putting it away, and he wasn't entirely sure why. These were 2 people who had seen something they didn't yet have a name for. My job, Diane's job, Marcus's job, was to give it a name before Ethan and Vanessa realized anyone was looking. I finished my eggs and folded the manila folder and put it in my bag and left Hazel's, and I did not feel triumphant. I felt tired and old and very focused, and I thought about how the most dangerous thing you can do to a person who thinks they've won is let them go on thinking it a little while longer. Chum. Here is something no one tells you about being betrayed by your own child. The anger doesn't come first. People assume it does. They picture the wronged mother furious and sharp-tongued, demanding answers, making phone calls at midnight. That's the version they write in movies because fury is visible and compelling and easy to understand. But fury takes energy, and the first thing betrayal does is take your energy. Before the anger, before anything else, there is just this enormous quiet heaviness, like something has been removed from the inside of your chest, and the space where it was keeps collapsing inward. I felt that heaviness every morning when I woke up in the motel room. It was there while I showered and dressed and made the instant coffee from the little basket on the dresser. It sat with me in Diane's office and in Hazel's corner booth and in the parking lot of the county recorder's office, where Marcus and I had spent half a day combing through documents. What I did not do, and this is the part I'm most proud of looking back, was let the heaviness stop me. Gerald used to say I was the most stubborn woman he had ever loved, and he always said it like a compliment, which it was. Stubbornness in a good person is just perseverance with stronger opinions. I held on to that. I held on to Gerald's voice in my head saying it, and I kept moving. By the end of the second week after filing, we had something concrete. Diane had brought in a forensic document examiner, a woman named Dr. Paulette Sims, who had testified as an expert witness in 14 fraud cases across 3 states, and who looked at the signature on the quitclaim deed for approximately 45 seconds before she said, "This is not a naturally produced signature. The pen pressure is wrong. The baseline trajectory is inconsistent, and there are 2 letter formations in the surname that indicate copying rather than fluent production." "In plain English?" I asked. "Someone practiced your signature and reproduced it from memory," she said. "They were good at it, but not good enough. Signatures are like fingerprints. Everyone's has its own rhythm. You can't fake the rhythm." She would put it all in a report, 47 pages, exhibits included, photographs of the questioned signature magnified and annotated alongside samples of my genuine signature from bank documents and tax returns, and the living trust Diane had helped me establish a year and a half earlier. 47 pages that said, in the formal language of expert testimony, this woman's name was stolen from her. I cried that night. I didn't want to, but I did. Not from despair. I want to be clear about that, but from something I can only describe as relief so profound it had nowhere to go but out. I sat in the motel room with the television off and the curtains open to the parking lot lights, and I cried until my ribs hurt, and then I washed my face and called Ruth. "How are you holding up?" she asked. She had been asking me that every day, in the specific, careful way of a person who suspects the answer but doesn't want to push. "I'm all right," I said. "We got the expert report." A pause. Then, "Good. Good, Marlene." Another pause. "Do you want me to come?" "Not yet," I said. "Stay where you are. I'll call you when I need you." She trusted me. That was the thing about Ruth. She had been trusting me since we were girls, even when she thought I was wrong, even when she thought I was going to get hurt. She trusted me, and sometimes that was the most sustaining thing in the world. Meanwhile, and this is the part that still turns my stomach when I think about it, still makes something cold move through me even now, Ethan and Vanessa were celebrating. Carol Peabody kept me informed, more than I asked her to, and more than was probably wise for either of us. Carol was not a gossip in the malicious sense. She was a woman who valued her neighborhood and her neighbors and who had watched Ethan grow up and who could not fully process what she knew he had done. So she coped by updating me with a compulsive regularity that I eventually stopped trying to discourage. She told me that the week after the sale closed, Ethan and Vanessa had hosted a dinner party at the condo they were renting while the Ashford Heights property was finalized. She knew because she had run into one of the guests, a woman named Brianna who had worked briefly with Vanessa, at the grocery store. Brianna, apparently not knowing anything was wrong, had described the evening in affectionate detail. Champagne, catered food from a restaurant in the Arts District, Vanessa, an address that cost, by Brianna's estimate, somewhere around $3,000. Ethan had made a toast, Brianna said. He had stood up with his champagne glass and said something about new beginnings, about building the life they deserved. When Carol told me this, I was quiet for so long that she asked if I was still there. "I'm here," I said. "I'm sorry, Marlene, I thought you should know." "You're right," I said. "I should know." After I hung up, I sat with that image, my son, standing in a rented condo with stolen money in his bank account, raising a glass to the life he deserved. I turned it over and looked at all its angles. I let myself feel every single thing it made me feel. And then I thought, the life you deserve. Let's see about that. And then it was Patricia who first told me about the second lawsuit. "Second lawsuit?" I said. We were on the phone. It was a Friday afternoon, 5 weeks after Diane had filed. "Marcus found it this morning," she said. "Vanessa's brother, Douglas, the one connected to Horizon Pacific, he's in a separate legal dispute with an investor in Nevada. Something to do with a commercial real estate deal that went sideways. The investor filed 8 months ago. It's been sitting in arbitration." I processed this. So Douglas Pritchard is already in legal trouble. "And Horizon Pacific is named as a respondent in that arbitration," Patricia said, "which means the same LLC that just purchased your house is already under scrutiny for a separate transaction in another state." This was the piece I hadn't seen coming. I'm not sure why. In retrospect, it made perfect sense. People who commit fraud once usually have a pattern. People who use shell companies to move money usually have done it before. Douglas Pritchard and the Horizon Pacific entity had been used as a vehicle, and vehicles that get used for one fraudulent transaction tend to have mileage from others. Diane, when I relayed this to her, said exactly what I expected her to say. "This is very good, Marlene. Can it be connected to our case?" "If their attorneys in Nevada are willing to share discovery, possibly. At minimum, it establishes a pattern of behavior." She paused. "It also means Douglas Pritchard has every incentive to cooperate with us rather than against us, if the alternative is more exposure in the Nevada matter." I understood what she meant. Douglas Pritchard was suddenly a person who needed to be on the right side of things. Whether he chose to be was a different question, but the pressure was there. Pressure, I had learned in 31 years of managing departments, does most of the work if you know how to apply it. The call came on a Thursday evening, 6 weeks after the filing. I was in Diane's waiting room, reviewing documents for a morning meeting, when my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. Then something, I don't know what, just some instinct, made me answer. Mom, Ethan's voice. I had not heard it in nearly 3 months. It landed differently than I expected, not as a gut punch, the way I had braced for, but as something smaller and sadder. He sounded like a person who had been rehearsing something and had forgotten half of it. Ethan, I said. A pause. Then, I got some paperwork. I imagine you did. Another pause. He was breathing in a way that told me he was working to control it. I need to know what you're doing. I think the paperwork explains what I'm doing, I said. Mom. His voice shifted, softer, trying to find a register that might move me. Can we just talk? Can we please just sit down and talk about this? Like what? I said. I kept my voice even. I had practiced this, in a sense. Not the words, but the stillness. Like family? He didn't answer right away. I heard him exhale. I made a mistake, he said. I waited. Things got out of hand. Vanessa and I were in a really bad place financially, and I thought, I don't know what I thought. I convinced myself you wouldn't, that you'd understand eventually. You forged my signature, Ethan, I said, on a legal document. You sold my home while I was recovering from surgery, and you changed the locks before I got back, and then you spent the money. I paused. I want you to tell me which part of that you think I would understand. Silence. Ethan. I know, he said. It came out very quietly. I know what I did. Good, I said. Then you understand why we're where we are. Mom, I need you to stop this. If this goes forward, if the lawsuit goes forward, we lose everything. The house we were going to buy, the accounts, all of it. Vanessa is... He stopped. Vanessa is what? She's saying this is your fault. The words came out rough, like they'd snagged on something on the way up. She's saying you were always trying to control things, that you always held the house over our heads, that you... She's got a whole version of this, Mom, where she's the one who was wronged. I almost said something then. I stopped myself. Because what I heard underneath those words, underneath the reporting of Vanessa's narrative, was something much more significant. I heard a man whose wife had handed him a story he didn't entirely believe and told him to go sell it to his mother. I heard a man who had called not to threaten me, but because he was frightened, not of me, of what he'd done. That did not change what I was going to do. But it was information. Then let her say that, I said. In court, under oath. He went quiet again. Then, is there anything I can say to you right now that would change your mind? I thought about that. I thought about it honestly, the way he deserved even after everything. No, I said. But I want you to hear me. I'm not doing this out of spite. I'm not doing this to punish you. I'm doing this because you took something that was mine and I intend to get it back. That's all this is. That's all it is, he repeated. There was something hollow in his voice now, like a room after the furniture's been cleared out. Take care of yourself, I said, and I hung up. I sat in Diane's waiting room for a long time after that. The receptionist asked twice if I needed anything, and I said no, thank you, I'm fine. And eventually she stopped asking and just left a cup of water on the table beside me, and I was grateful for that small, undemanding kindness. What I did not know at the time, what I would only learn much later, through the kind of lateral information that surfaces during discovery when everyone is forced to put things in writing, was what was happening on the other side of that phone call. Vanessa had been in the room with Ethan when he called me. She had stood beside him, close enough to hear, and when he hung up, she had said, according to Ethan's later account, "That went about as well as I expected." She was not scared yet. That is the crucial thing to understand. At the point of that phone call, Vanessa still believed the situation was manageable. She believed this because she was, at her core, a person who had always found ways to manage things, to reframe, to redirect, to locate the pressure point in any situation and apply the right amount of charm or aggression until things moved the way she wanted. She had been doing it her whole life. She had been doing it to Ethan for 7 years. What she had not done in all those years of maneuvering was encounter anyone who wouldn't move. She was about to. Marcus Chen delivered his full financial forensics report at the end of week 7. It was 89 pages. It traced, in meticulous and merciless detail, the journey of every dollar from the sale of 4817 Birchwood Drive, the wire to Vanessa's personal account, the subsequent transfers, the Mercedes, the Ashford Heights escrow, the vendors, the deposits, the withdrawals, the timing of each. But more significantly, it traced something I hadn't expected him to find, a pattern of smaller transfers going back 14 months, from a business account in Ethan's name to an account associated with Vanessa's personal holdings. The amounts were not enormous, $3,000 here, $5,000 there, but the consistency was striking. Marcus, in the careful language of someone who has learned to let the numbers speak without editorializing, noted in his summary that the transfers showed a systematic pattern of asset movement consistent with financial planning in anticipation of a specific event. In plain language, someone had been getting money ready to move for over a year. This had not been an impulsive decision. This had not been, as Ethan had described it on the phone, things getting out of hand. This had been planned, incremental, deliberate. I read that section of the report 3 times. Then I called Diane. "The transfers go back 14 months, I said. "I see that," she said. "He was planning this while I was still living in the house, while he was still coming to dinner." My voice was steady. I made it steady. While I was making his favorite pot roast and asking him how work was going. "Marlene, I need a minute," I said. She gave me one. When I came back, I said that this changes the civil complaint? "It significantly strengthens the fraud element," she said. "Premeditation matters, even in civil actions. It also supports adding a count of financial elder abuse, which carries different damages." "Add it," I said. I intended to. There was one more thing Marcus had flagged, almost as a footnote, but one that I knew immediately was not a footnote at all. Among the Horizon Pacific corporate filings, there was an operating agreement that listed the responsibilities of each member. Douglas Pritchard, as managing member, had signed a declaration stating that he had verified the legal authority of all sellers in transactions facilitated by the company. He had signed that declaration 10 days before the close of the Birchwood Drive sale, which meant Douglas Pritchard had stated, in a legal document under his name, that he had verified Marlene Whitaker had the legal authority and willingness to sell her property. He had not verified any such thing. He had never spoken to me in his life. That declaration was what Diane later called, with her particular brand of quiet precision, the document that makes the whole structure fall. Because it meant Douglas wasn't just a passive vehicle. It meant he had signed a lie. And a signed lie, in a legal context, is not a problem you can manage your way out of with charm or reframing or a well-constructed alternate narrative. It is simply a lie that now has your name on it. Vanessa found out about the forensics report on a Tuesday. I don't know exactly how. Discovery moves in ways that are not always linear, and information moves faster than formal timelines in a small county legal community. But she found out, and according to Carol, who heard it secondhand from Brianna, who had apparently remained in uneasy contact with Vanessa through all of this, Vanessa's response was not fear. Her response was fury. She called Ethan in the middle of the afternoon and told him the lawsuit was going to destroy them, and that he needed to do something about it immediately. She told him his mother was a vindictive woman who had never accepted her, who had always tried to control him, who had engineered this entire situation to humiliate them. She told him he needed to find an attorney who could fight this aggressively, and that the attorney he currently had was not aggressive enough. What she did not tell him, and what he would only find out weeks later, was that she had called her brother Douglas the same day, and the call had not gone well. Douglas Pritchard, facing his own legal exposure from the Nevada matter, and now this new evidence of a signed false declaration, was reconsidering his position rapidly. He had his own attorney. His own attorney had begun advising him that cooperation might be in his best interests. The structure Vanessa had believed was solid. The layered LLCs, the corporate distances, the carefully arranged signatures was not solid. It was a scaffold. And scaffolds, when one piece goes wrong, tend to come apart in sequence. She didn't know that yet, but the sound of it beginning to come apart was already there, underneath everything, if you knew what to listen for. I knew what to listen for. I moved out of the motel at the end of the second month. Carol had offered her guest room again, and this time I accepted, partly for practical reasons, partly because I was tired of the instant coffee and the parking lot view, and partly, if I'm honest, because I needed to be near people who knew me, who remembered who I was before all of this. Carol's guest room had yellow walls and a quilt her grandmother had made, and the first morning I woke up there, I lay in the quiet and listened to her moving around in the kitchen downstairs. The sound of the coffee grinder, the particular creak of the cabinet door she'd been meaning to fix for years. And I thought about how grief and gratitude sometimes live in exactly the same room. I missed my house, not as property, not as an asset. I missed it the way you miss a person. The particular quality of the morning light through the bedroom windows, the way the kitchen floor had one board that sang when you stepped on it near the stove, the roses on the left side of the porch that needed cutting back before the first frost. Whether or not I got it back, those things were gone. The new owners, the Horizon Pacific LLC and whatever plans Douglas Pritchard had for the property had likely already changed what could be changed. You cannot unchange a house any more than you can unchange the year you spent watching your son plan to take it from you. But here's what I also knew. Lying in Carol's guest room with the quilt on my chest and the sound of the coffee grinder coming up through the floor, the house was never the whole story. I had made the mistake of believing it was, for too long. The house was what they took, what they could not take, what was never transferable, never forgeable, never subject to a wire transfer or a corporate LLC, was everything I was before I ever owned it and everything I would be after. That was not something Ethan and Vanessa had understood when they planned this. They had looked at my life and seen an asset. They had not understood that the most important things I possessed had no dollar value, and their failure to understand that was going to cost them everything they'd spent. The call I had been waiting for came on a Thursday morning, while I was sitting in Carol's kitchen with my second cup of real coffee and the newspaper. Diane's voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it I recognized after months of working together. A particular kind of controlled excitement that precise people allow themselves when something important breaks the way it needs to. Douglas Pritchard's attorney contacted me this morning, she said. I set the coffee down. And? He wants to discuss cooperation. Full cooperation, apparently. Documents, communications, everything related to the Birchwood transaction. She paused. His attorney used the phrase, complete package. I was quiet for a moment. Outside Carol's kitchen window, a pair of sparrows were arguing over something in the yard. One of them won and flew off, and the other one just sat there on the fence for a moment, looking confused. What does he want in return? I asked. Reduced exposure. He's more worried about Nevada, honestly. That case is further along, but he wants this one off his back too. What do you need from me? Your authorization to proceed with negotiations, she said, and your patience for another few weeks while we see what he actually hands over. You have both, I said. After I hung up, I sat with the newspaper I wasn't reading, in Carol's kitchen that smelled like good coffee and the particular domestic safety of a place where someone has chosen, every day, to keep things warm. And I thought about Vanessa Pritchard, in whatever expensive room she currently occupied, absolutely certain she had handled everything. The LLC, the transfers, the distances, the narrative. Not knowing her brother had just decided to become my witness. Not knowing that the scaffold was already on its way down. That was the moment. If I had to point to one, the moment I knew with my whole body, not just my mind, that this was going to go the way it needed to go, that was it. Not because I felt powerful. I didn't feel powerful. I felt like a 73-year-old woman sitting in someone else's kitchen, missing her house and her husband and the version of her son she'd lost somewhere along the way. But also like a woman who had done every single thing right, and who was not done yet. Douglas Pritchard's cooperation package arrived on a Monday. Diane called me at 8:15 in the morning, before I had finished my first cup of coffee, and the particular quality of the silence before she spoke told me this was not a routine update. Diane Howell was not a woman who paused unnecessarily. When she paused, it meant she was choosing how to deliver something that required care. He gave us everything, she said. I set the coffee down. Define everything. Emails, text messages, a recorded phone call. Another pause. Ethan called Douglas 7 weeks before your surgery to discuss the transaction. The call was recorded on Douglas's end. Apparently, he records business calls as a matter of habit. Ethan outlines the entire plan. The timeline, the notary arrangement, the wire transfer structure. He mentioned specifically that you would be, his word, unavailable during the recovery period. I sat with that for a moment. Unavailable. The word my son had used to describe his mother while she was in another state healing from a surgical procedure. Unavailable. As if I were a line item in a project plan rather than a human being who had carried him inside her body. How clear is the recording? I asked. Dr. Sims has already reviewed the audio. She can confirm voice identification if needed. But honestly, Marlene, it's clear enough that we may not need her for that. Diane let the weight of that settle. He also provided the original email chain between himself and Ethan going back 11 months before the sale. Every step of the planning, venue searches, timeline discussions, the specific arrangement with Clifton Reeves. 11 months. 11 months of emails while Ethan sat at my kitchen table and ate my food and told me how work was going and asked after my hip with the particular concerned tone of a man who knew exactly when that hip was going to be replaced and had already built a plan around it. I pressed my fingers against the edge of the table and breathed. Marlene, Diane said, are you all right? No, I said, but that's not the question right now. What's the question right now is what we do with all of it. We file the amended complaint today, she said. We add the recorded evidence to the discovery package, and we request an expedited hearing date. Given what we have now, the forensics, the expert report, the notary statement, and the Douglas cooperation package, I believe we can make a compelling argument for emergency relief, including a motion to freeze the remaining assets pending judgment. The Ashford Heights escrow, I said, and the vehicle, and whatever is left in the transferred accounts. She paused again. Marlene, I want to prepare you. This is going to move fast now. The other side will know within days what we have. Their attorneys will advise them to counteroffer before this reaches a courtroom. And if they offer, that's your decision. I'll advise, but the decision is yours. I looked out Carol's kitchen window. The sparrows were back on the fence, or maybe different sparrows. I couldn't tell. The yard was the same ordinary yard it had been every morning, the kind of yard that didn't know or care about recorded phone calls or forensic accountants or what a son had said about his mother being unavailable. Let's see what they offer, I said, and then let's go to court anyway. The counteroffer came 8 days later, delivered through Ethan's attorney, a man named Philip Garrett, who had a reputation in Claremont County for being aggressive in commercial disputes, and who was, by all accounts, good at his job. The offer was this: full return of the sale proceeds, minus attorney's fees on both sides, with a mutual non-disclosure agreement preventing either party from discussing the matter publicly, and a release of all civil claims. No admission of wrongdoing. I read the offer twice, sitting across from Diane in her office. Then I read it a third time. Then I looked up. No, I said. Diane nodded once, as if she had expected exactly this answer. There are things to consider. There are always things to consider, I said. The answer is no. I want the admission of wrongdoing. I want the record to reflect what was done and who did it. The money I can get back through judgment. The record. That only happens in court. A trial is harder, she said. On you specifically. You'll testify. It will be public. I know. Ethan and Vanessa's attorneys will try to damage your credibility. They'll try to establish that the house was always intended to be shared, that you had agreed in principle to some kind of co-ownership arrangement. Let them try, I said. I have 31 years of tax returns showing sole ownership and a living trust established 18 months before the sale that names no co-owner. I have a mortgage paid off in my name alone. I have 40 years of property tax records. I paused. Let them stand in a courtroom and tell that story with all of that sitting in front of them. Diane looked at me for a moment with the particular expression of an attorney who respects a client's position even when she also wants to protect them. All right, she said. I'll notify Garrett that the offer is rejected. Tell him we're ready to proceed. The trial date was set for 11 weeks out. It felt like a long time. It was not, Trabad. I should tell you about the deposition, because it is the part of this story that I think about most often when I am trying to understand what my son became and when he became it. Depositions are strange things. They take place in conference rooms, not courtrooms, smaller, quieter, without the formality of a judge or a gallery. It is just attorneys and a court reporter and the person answering questions. And there is something about the intimacy of that setting that makes the truth harder to hide and harder to hear. Ethan's deposition was scheduled for a Thursday morning. I was not required to be there, and Diane had gently suggested I might prefer not to attend. I went anyway. I sat in the back of the conference room at the table's end, as was my right as a party, and I watched my son walk in. He looked different than I remembered, not older exactly, thinner, maybe, in the face. The kind of thin that comes from not sleeping and not eating and spending too much time in rooms where people are telling you how bad things are. His suit was the charcoal one he'd worn to Gerald's funeral, which struck me as either a coincidence or something he'd done without realizing. He sat down across from Diane, and he didn't look at me for the first 20 minutes. When he finally did look, just briefly, what I saw in his face was not defiance. It was not the cold calculation of the man who had made 11 months of email plans and recorded phone calls. What I saw was something much worse in its way. He looked like a man who had done a thing and then had to keep living in the same body that had done it and was finding that harder than he'd expected. I did not feel sorry for him. I want to be honest about that. I felt something that was adjacent to sorrow, but not the same thing. But it was not the kind that softens resolve. It was the kind that clarifies it. Diane's questioning was methodical. She started with the financial history, the transfers, the timeline, the accounts. Ethan answered with his attorney whispering corrections every few minutes, and the answers were careful and minimal in the way of a person who has been told to say as little as possible. But careful and minimal answers still answer, and the answers added up. Then she played the recording. I had heard it twice already. I thought I was prepared. I was not entirely for the experience of hearing it in a room with Ethan present. His own voice, relaxed and businesslike, describing the plan. Describing me. The word unavailable again, this time in his own voice. And I watched his face while the recording played, and I saw the exact moment he understood that there was no version of this conversation that could be reframed or contextualized or talked around. His attorney objected to the recording's admissibility. Diane had anticipated every objection and had responses ready. The objections were noted for the record and overruled in substance, though the formal ruling would come from the judge. When the recording finished, the conference room was very quiet. Diane said, "Mr. Whitaker, is that your voice in that recording?" Ethan looked at his attorney. His attorney made a small gesture, and almost imperceptible, but I was watching. Then Ethan said, "Yes. And in that recording, you describe a plan to sell a property at 4817 Birchwood Drive without the knowledge or consent of Marlene Whitaker, who is both the legal owner of that property and your mother. Is that an accurate characterization of what is discussed in that recording?" A long pause. His attorney said, "Objection, compound." "I'll rephrase," Diane said pleasantly. "In that recording, are you discussing the sale of 4817 Birchwood Drive?" "Yes." "And at the time of that recording, was Marlene Whitaker aware that you were planning to sell that property?" Another pause, longer this time. "No," Ethan said. It was the smallest word, one syllable, and it landed in the room like something dropped from a very great height. I watched my son say that word, and I thought about how there is a version of every person that is capable of the worst thing they will ever do, and how the tragedy is not always in the doing, but in the fact that you can look at someone you love and not see that version coming, and then one day it arrives, and you understand that it was always there, and it has always been part of them, just waiting for the right circumstances to surface. I had not seen it coming. I would spend a long time after this making my peace with that. Vanessa's deposition was a different experience entirely. Where Ethan had been deflated and minimal, Vanessa arrived at her deposition like a person who had decided that the best defense was an alternate reality. She came in composed, hair done, clothes appropriate in a way that felt calculated, posture suggesting someone who found this whole proceeding slightly beneath her. She answered questions with the particular energy of a woman who has been misunderstood all her life and has grown impatient with it. She claimed she had genuinely believed, that the house sale was legitimate. She claimed Ethan had told her I had agreed to sell and wanted to move somewhere smaller. She claimed the money in her account was simply where Ethan had chosen to put the proceeds while he figured out the distribution. She said it all smoothly and consistently, and with a conviction that would have been impressive if every piece of documentary evidence in existence hadn't directly contradicted it. Diane let her finish. Then she laid the email chain on the table. Mrs. Whitaker, I'm showing you what has been marked as Exhibit 17. This is an email exchange between you and your brother Douglas Pritchard, dated approximately 14 months before the sale of 4817 Birchwood Drive. In the third email in this chain, you write, and I'm quoting directly, "The key is the surgery window. She'll be gone at least 6 weeks, and Ethan says she doesn't always read the mail right away. That's our window." Can you explain what you meant by that? Vanessa looked at the email for a long time. I watched her look at it. I watched her understand that she was looking at her own words, in her own handwriting style, with her own email address in the header, and there was nowhere for those words to go except where they were. That was taken out of context, she said. What context would you like to provide? Diane said. We were discussing, Ethan and I had talked about eventually approaching Marlene about the house. The email was about timing a conversation, a family conversation. A family conversation about selling her house without telling her. That's not... She stopped. Started again. I'm not going to sit here and let you characterize... Mrs. Whitaker. Diane's voice was calm. Absolutely, immovably calm. The email also references, in the next paragraph, a conversation with Clifton Reeves about notarization services for a document signed by a power of attorney representative. Can you explain who the power of attorney representative was? Vanessa's composure, the thing she had walked in with, the thing she had spent 45 minutes maintaining, developed a visible crack. It was small. Someone who hadn't been watching as carefully as I was might have missed it, but I was watching very carefully. I need to consult with my attorney, she said. Of course, Diane said. The break lasted 12 minutes. When they came back, Vanessa's answers were shorter and more guarded, which meant they were also less coherent and more damaging, because a person who has constructed an elaborate false narrative cannot make it smaller without exposing its seams. By the end of the deposition, she had contradicted herself on 4 separate points, all of which Diane had documented with the patient precision of someone who had been expecting exactly that. Outside the conference room afterward, in the narrow hallway where I was putting on my coat, I heard Vanessa's attorney speaking to her in a low, urgent voice. I couldn't make out the words, but I could make out the tone, and the tone was the sound of a person explaining to their client that things were worse than the client had believed. I went home to Carol's house and ate dinner and did not sleep well, not because I was afraid of how things were going, but because I was beginning to feel, underneath everything, the enormous accumulated weight of how much this had cost me. Not financially. The financial piece was almost resolved one way or another, but in other ways. In ways that don't appear on forensic accounting reports or legal complaints. The weight of months in a motel in a borrowed guest room. The weight of a key that no longer fit. The weight of a son I was going to have to find a way to think about for the rest of my life. That weight didn't keep me from what I had to do. But I felt it. I want you to know I felt every ounce of it. The trial began on a Tuesday in March. Claremont County Courthouse was a building I had passed hundreds of times and entered only twice, once for jury duty in 1987, once to file a small claims matter involving a contractor who had done poor work on my roof. It was an older building, the kind with high ceilings and wooden benches worn smooth by decades of people sitting on them with their hands folded and their futures uncertain. I found the familiarity of that discomfort oddly steadying. The gallery was not full, but it was not empty. Carol was there, in the 3rd row, wearing a blue cardigan and looking like she was trying very hard not to look nervous on my behalf. Patricia Okafor was there. Ruth had driven in from Denton the night before and was sitting 2 seats from Carol, and when I walked past, she squeezed my hand once and let go, which was exactly the right amount. Ethan and Vanessa sat at the defendant's table. Philip Garrett was with them, along with a second attorney I didn't recognize, younger, sharp-suited, the kind of addition you make to a legal team when you're very worried. Vanessa was dressed conservatively, which I noticed because it was the first time I had ever seen her dress conservatively. Ethan sat very still and did not turn to look at the gallery. The Honorable Margaret Osei presided. She was a compact woman in her late 50s with close-cropped natural hair and reading glasses she wore pushed up on her forehead until she needed them, at which point she lowered them with the decisive efficiency of a person who does not waste motion. She had a reputation, according to Diane, for zero tolerance for theatrics and considerable patience for evidence. That was the combination I wanted. The opening statements took the morning. Diane's was measured and factual, and she laid out the evidence in a sequence so logical it felt almost gentle, right up until the moment she described what had been done to me, at which point it did not feel gentle at all. She used the word fraud 7 times. She used the phrase elder financial abuse 3 times. She used the phrase forged signature twice, both times with the document examiner's report cited by exhibit number. Philip Garrett's opening was more interesting because it revealed the strategy I had anticipated and Diane had prepared for. He did not deny the sale. He did not claim I had consented. Instead, he argued that Ethan had acted under the sincere but mistaken belief that I had, in previous conversations, expressed willingness to transfer the property, that this was a family miscommunication of tragic proportions, not a criminal conspiracy. He used the word tragic 4 times. He did not use the word forged once. When he was done, Judge Osei looked at the gallery for a moment in a way that suggested she had heard a great many opening statements in her career and had developed views about their reliability. Then she called a recess for lunch. The afternoon of the first day was Dr. Paulette Sims. She was the kind of expert witness who makes a jury, or in this case, a judge, understand exactly why expert witnesses exist. She was clear and unshowy, and she had a gift for translating technical analysis into ordinary language without making anyone feel condescended to. She set up her enlarged exhibits, the question signature alongside genuine samples from my tax returns and the living trust document, and she walked through her analysis point by point: pen pressure distribution, baseline trajectory, letter formation in the surname, the specific inconsistency in the loop of the capital W, the evidence of tracing behavior, the microscopic hesitations in the stroke that distinguish a copied signature from a fluent one. Philip Garrett cross-examined her for 45 minutes. He challenged her methodology, her sample size, her qualifications in this specific subfield. She answered each challenge with the equanimity of a woman who had been challenged in 14 prior cases and had not lost her footing in any of them. When he finally sat down, the enlarged exhibit of the forged signature was still on the display, and nothing he had said had changed what was visible in it. The second witness that afternoon was Sandra Fitch, the credit union employee who had flagged Ethan's account. Her testimony was shorter. She described what she had seen, what she had noted, what the internal memos documented. Garrett objected several times to relevance. Judge Osei overruled each objection in the patient tone of a judge who has already read the evidence package and understands exactly why it's relevant. By the end of the first day, Garrett's co-counsel was making more notes than he had been in the morning. That was a sign. Attorneys who are confident don't accelerate their note-taking. They accelerate their note-taking when they are recalculating. That night, I ate dinner at Carol's kitchen table, roast chicken, simple and good. And Ruth talked about her garden, and Patricia told a story about something that had happened at her office that had nothing to do with any of this. And I was grateful, more than I could say, for an evening that was about ordinary things. So, the second day of trial was the day everything broke. Marcus Chen testified in the morning, walking through the forensic accounting report with the unhurried confidence of a man who had prepared 89 pages and was comfortable explaining all of them. The wire transfers, the pattern of pre-sale movements, the spending in the weeks after closing, the connection to Douglas Pritchard through Horizon Pacific. Then Diane played the recording. I had known it was coming. I had heard it 4 times by now. And still, when Ethan's voice filled that courtroom, calm, businesslike, saying the word unavailable in the context of my surgery, outlining the timeline and the notary arrangement with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone discussing a logistics problem, I felt the room change. I heard a woman in the gallery make a small, sharp sound. I did not look to see who it was. Garrett objected to the recording's admissibility on 3 grounds. Judge Osei heard each objection, asked Diane to respond, and overruled all 3. Then she asked the court reporter to note for the record that the recording had been admitted into evidence in full. Then she looked at the defense table with her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and she said, "Mr. Garrett, you'll have your opportunity for rebuttal. Proceed, Ms. Howell." Diane proceeded. The emails came next. The chain between Vanessa and Douglas, the chain between Ethan and Douglas, the planning emails going back 11 months. They were read into the record one by one, each one a sentence or a paragraph from my son in his wife's own hands, and together they built something that couldn't be unmistakable because it already was. Garrett's cross-examination of Marcus Chen was aggressive in a way that read as desperation. He challenged the interpretation of the financial transfers, suggested the pre-sale movements were consistent with legitimate financial planning, argued that the forensic conclusions overstated the evidence. Marcus answered each challenge without emotion and without yielding, because the numbers did not yield, and he had no personal stake in making them. When Marcus stepped down, Garrett asked for a brief recess. Judge Osei granted 15 minutes. I went to the hallway with Diane, and we stood near a window that looked out on the courthouse steps, and she said quietly, "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine," I said. "What happens when we go back in?" "Clifton Reeves," she said. Clifton Reeves was the notary. He had agreed to testify under a limited immunity arrangement relating to his own regulatory matter. He was 61 years old and looked, when he took the stand that afternoon, like a man who had not slept well in several months and had lost weight in the way people do when their conscience is eating more than they are. He admitted, under direct examination, that he had not witnessed Marlene Whitaker sign the quitclaim deed. He admitted that Ethan Whitaker had presented the documents pre-signed and had represented that the owner was unable to appear in person. He admitted that he had asked no further questions and had applied his notary stamp without verifying the signature. He admitted that he had known, on some level, that this was wrong. "Did Mr. Whitaker offer you any compensation beyond his standard notary fee?" Diane asked. Reeves looked at the table in front of him for a moment. Then he said, "He gave me $500 in cash. He said it was for the inconvenience of traveling to his office." The courtroom was very quiet. "And did you understand at that time that what you were doing might constitute fraud?" Diane asked. Another pause. Longer. Then, in the voice of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has finally been told he can set it down, "Yes." Garrett put Ethan on the stand. I had expected this. He needed to testify. The alternative was allowing Diane's evidence to stand unchallenged, which was worse. Garrett needed Ethan to be a sympathetic person in front of the judge, to be remorseful, to provide whatever counter-narrative was still salvageable. What he got instead was a man who had clearly been through too much in the past months to perform coherent sympathy. Ethan answered Garrett's questions in the stilted way of someone reciting something learned rather than experienced. Yes, he had been under severe financial pressure. Yes, he had made poor decisions. Yes, he recognized that he should have handled things differently. The language was careful and mechanical, and it had the specific quality of statements written by an attorney and memorized rather than felt. Then Diane cross-examined him. She didn't raise her voice. She never raised her voice. She simply walked him through the timeline. The first contact with Douglas Pritchard, the email chains, the notary arrangement, the recording, and asked him at each step to confirm that her description of events was accurate. He confirmed. One step at a time, he confirmed. "Mr. Whitaker," she said near the end, "at the time you initiated this plan, your mother was alive, physically present, mentally competent, and the sole legal owner of 4817 Birchwood Drive?" "Yes." "She had not agreed to sell the property?" "No." "She had not agreed to transfer it to you or anyone else?" "No." "And you proceeded anyway?" It wasn't a question, but he answered it. "Yes," he said. I was watching him when he said it. He was not looking at Garrett. He was not looking at Vanessa. For just a moment, in the way that sometimes happens in the middle of something irrevocable, he was looking at me. I held his gaze. I did not look away, and I did not look soft, and I did not give him the absolution he might have been looking for in my face. I held his gaze until he looked down at the table, and then I breathed, and I looked at the judge. Vanessa did not testify. Garrett had made that decision before the second day even started, and I understood why. After the deposition, after the emails, after the recording, putting her on the stand would have been handing Diane a loaded question with a known answer. Garrett made his closing argument on the afternoon of the second day. It was shorter than his opening. The tragedy framing was still there, but it had the specific hollowness of a story that knows it is already lost. Diane's closing was 18 minutes. She summarized the evidence in a sequence so tight and so clear that it left no space for interpretation. She ended by saying, "Marlene Whitaker did not come to this court looking for revenge. She came here because the law exists precisely for moments like this, when a person who cannot be reasoned with and cannot be shamed must instead be stopped. The evidence in this case is not complicated. The only question before this court is whether what was done to her will be recognized for what it was." Judge Osei called a recess. We waited. I sat in the hallway with Ruth on one side and Carol on the other, and nobody talked very much, which was the right call. Patricia brought coffee from a machine down the hall that tasted terrible, and I drank it because having something to hold was useful. 47 minutes. That was how long Judge Osei took. When we went back in, I watched her face as she settled at the bench and arranged her papers and lowered her reading glasses with that decisive efficiency I had cataloged on day one. Her expression gave nothing. Judges are trained to give nothing, and she was very good at her job. She spoke for 11 minutes. She found the signature on the quitclaim deed to be fraudulent, supported by clear expert testimony that had not been meaningfully challenged. She found the financial transfers to constitute intentional misappropriation of the proceeds of a fraudulent sale. She voided the transaction in its entirety. She ordered full restitution of the sale proceeds, $682,000, plus interest and legal costs. She referred the matter to the district attorney's office for review of potential criminal charges, specifically citing document fraud, elder financial abuse, and conspiracy. She looked at the defense table when she said the last part. Philip Garrett was writing something on his legal pad. His co-counsel was very still. Ethan was looking at the table in front of him. Vanessa. And this is the part I have never been able to forget, the part that lives most clearly in my memory of that day. Vanessa was looking at Judge Osei with an expression I had not seen on her face in 7 years of knowing her. It was an expression I could only describe as the look of a person who has believed her entire life that she was the protagonist of every story she was in, and who has just discovered irrevocably that she was not. I did not feel what I expected to feel. I had expected something clean, relief, or satisfaction, or the particular rightness of a thing restored. What I felt instead was complicated and heavy and very human. I felt the truth of it, that winning is not the opposite of loss, that getting something back is not the same as it never having been taken, that there are things a judgment can restore and things it cannot, and the things it cannot include the year of my life I had spent in motels and borrowed rooms and Diane's waiting room and the space of a hollowed-out grief I was going to be processing for a long time after this day. But I also felt something else. Underneath all of it, underneath the complication and the weight, there was something solid, something that had been there all along, that the whole of the past year had been in service of reaching. I had not let them take it. Not the house, not the money, and not, this was the part that mattered most, not the certainty of who I was. Ruth put her hand over mine on the courtroom bench, and I let her keep it there. And outside the high windows of the Claremont County Courthouse, the afternoon had gone the particular pale gold of late winter light, the kind that doesn't warm you, but makes everything look, briefly, like it has been clarified. I thought about the roses on the left side of the porch at 4817 Birchwood Drive, whether anyone had been tending them, whether they had made it through the winter without anyone who knew how. I thought I would go look once the property was released back into my name. I thought they were probably still there. The roses had made it through the winter. I went to see the house 2 weeks after the judgment, on a Thursday morning when the sky was the particular flat gray of early spring that can't quite decide whether it's done being cold. Diane had confirmed that the lease pendants had been formally released and the property was being processed back into my name, which would take another few weeks to complete through the county recorder's office. I wasn't going inside. I just needed to see it. I parked across the street where Carol's driveway used to feel familiar, and I sat in the car for a moment before I got out. The house looked the same from the outside. Same cream-colored siding, same black shutters, same 2 oaks in the front yard that had been putting on size since Ethan was 10 years old. Someone had power washed the front porch. The rose bushes on the left side had been cut back, not the way I would have cut them, a little too aggressively, but they were alive. New growth already coming in at the base, small and determined and red. I stood on the sidewalk for a long time looking at them. There are moments in life that are too large to feel all at once, and this was one of them. I did not cry. I was not certain what I felt exactly, except that it was large and tangled and had no clean name. Relief was part of it. Grief was part of it. Something that might have been resolve or might just have been exhaustion that had reorganized itself into the shape of resolve, because sometimes that's the only way to keep moving. I took one photograph on my phone, the front of the house, the oaks, the rose bushes in the corner of the frame. Then I got back in the car and drove to Carol's and made coffee and called Ruth and didn't say much, and Ruth, who has always understood when not to ask, didn't say much either. That was the morning. The afternoon was different. Marcus Chen called at 2 o'clock with the update I had been waiting for, and also, in the way of updates that contain more than one thing, had not entirely been prepared for. The restitution order required Ethan and Vanessa to return $682,000 plus legal costs and interest within 90 days. That was the civil judgment. But 90 days from the judgment date, the financial picture on their end was considerably different than the picture that had existed the day the wire transfer arrived in Vanessa's account. The Mercedes had been purchased outright. That money was gone in the sense that it was now a depreciating vehicle. The Ashford Heights escrow, the dream property, the $900,000 house in the gated community, had been frozen by court order mid-process, which meant the earnest money and the initial deposit were tied up in legal limbo while the purchase contract dissolved. The renovation vendors, the furniture showroom, the interior design firm, those payments were simply gone, exchanged for goods and services that could not be liquidated at anything close to their purchase price. What remained in accessible accounts, according to Marcus's assessment, was approximately $340,000, slightly more than half of what they owed. The vehicle could be sold, Marcus said, though at a loss. There are some additional small accounts Vanessa held prior to the transaction that the court can reach, but the realistic ceiling, without a payment plan structure, is going to fall short of the full judgment. How short? I asked. 60 to 80,000 short, possibly more depending on attorney's fees. I sat with this. It was not what I had wanted to hear, not because of the money itself. I had lived within my means for 40 years and I could do it again, but because it meant that the judgment, clean and decisive as it had been, ran up against the oldest problem in civil law. You can win and still not fully collect because the people who took from you have already spent what they took. The criminal referral, I said. Does that change the calculation? That's Diane's territory, Marcus said carefully. But I'll say this. The DA's review is active. I know because they've already contacted me about the forensic report. Active review means something could move. And if charges are filed and there's a conviction, restitution as part of sentencing is a different mechanism than civil judgment. Meaning they'd have to pay regardless of what's in their accounts. Meaning it follows them. Yes. I thanked him and hung up, and I went to the window and looked at Carol's yard. The fence, the sparrows, the ordinary ongoing life of a neighborhood that had nothing to do with any of this. And I thought about $60,000 to $80,000 that might never come back. I thought about what it cost to try to protect yourself, and what it cost when the protection arrived too late to prevent the damage, only in time to stop it from continuing. Then I made a list. Not because the list would solve the gap, but because I have always made lists when things feel too large, and sometimes the act of writing things down converts them from overwhelming to merely difficult, and difficult things I knew how to handle. The list had 3 things on it: I was still looking at the list when Carol knocked on the guest room door and said dinner was ready. And I folded the paper and put it in my pocket and went downstairs and ate pot roast and tried to be present at the table, which I mostly managed. The criminal referral moved faster than I had expected. 6 weeks after the trial, the district attorney's office contacted Diane to inform her that charges were being considered against both Ethan Whitaker and Vanessa Whitaker for document fraud, financial elder abuse, and conspiracy to commit fraud. They were also considering a separate charge against Clifton Reeves for negligent notarization, though his cooperation agreement had significantly reduced his exposure. Douglas Pritchard, in a development that surprised almost no one at this point, had entered into a cooperation agreement with both the Claremont County DA and the Nevada Arbitration Panel. He was providing testimony in exchange for reduced exposure on both fronts. Whether he had done this out of genuine remorse or simple self-preservation was a question I had stopped being interested in. The effect was the same either way. Diane sat across from me when she delivered this update and watched my face with the careful attention she had developed over many months of delivering news that was significant in complicated ways. "They haven't formally charged yet," she said. "The DA is still reviewing, but the investigator told me they consider this a strong case." "How long?" I asked. "Another month, maybe 2. "And Ethan and Vanessa? Do they know?" "Their attorneys have been notified that they're subjects of a criminal investigation, yes." I nodded. I thought about Ethan knowing that. Waking up every morning knowing the DA's office was looking at his name and building something. I tried to identify what I felt about that and could not locate a clean answer. There was too much else in the way. "There's something else," Diane said. The quality of her voice changed slightly on those words. Not dramatic, just a shift, the way voices shift when they're about to deliver something they've been holding for a moment. I looked at her. "Philip Garrett contacted me this morning, not about the criminal matter. That's being handled by different counsel now. About the civil restitution. He wanted me to know that Ethan and Vanessa are liquidating assets to meet the judgment. The Mercedes is listed for sale. There are also some personal items, jewelry, some artwork they'd purchased, going through a consignment service." "That's what they're supposed to do," I said. "Yes, but he also wanted me to convey—" She paused. "He said they want to meet with you, Ethan and Vanessa, in person, outside of any legal proceeding." I looked at her for a long moment. "To what end?" He didn't specify. He used the word reconciliation. She said it in the careful, neutral tone of an attorney quoting someone else's word choice rather than endorsing it. I sat back in my chair. The fluorescent light in Diane's office had always had a faint flicker at a certain angle, and I had noticed it on my first visit and every visit since and had never mentioned it, the way you don't mention things that don't change anything. "Tell him I'll think about it," I said. Diane nodded. She did not offer an opinion because she was professional and it was not her place, but I knew her well enough by then to read the small, careful blankness of her expression, and what it said was, "Be careful." I intended to be. I did not think about it for long. 3 days, in the end. 3 days of Carol's kitchen and Ruth's phone calls, and the ordinary texture of a life that was slowly, imperfectly reassembling itself around me. I thought about what a meeting would mean, and what it wouldn't mean, and what Ethan and Vanessa wanted from it, and whether those wants were something I was obligated to address. I kept coming back to one thing, not forgiveness. I was not there yet, and I was not going to pretend I was, because pretending costs you something real, and I was done paying costs I hadn't agreed to. What I kept coming back to was information. I wanted to look at my son and his wife and understand fully not just what they had done, but what they believed they had done. Whether the story Vanessa had been telling, the story where I was controlling, where the house was always a shared thing, where they were the wronged parties, whether she had told it so many times that she actually believed it now. I needed to know that. I wasn't sure why exactly, but I needed to know it. I told Diane to tell Garrett I would meet them, at a location of my choosing, without attorneys present, for 1 hour. The location I chose was the small community center 3 blocks from Birchwood Drive, in a meeting room that anyone could reserve and that had the advantages of being public and neutral and familiar to me and not to them. Yes, they arrived 7 minutes late. I noticed that. I don't know if it was intentional or simply a consequence of people who are used to making entrances and have not yet adjusted to a world in which that habit no longer serves them. I was already seated at the table when they came in, with a cup of coffee I'd gotten from the machine in the lobby and had not yet touched, and I watched them walk across the room toward me. Ethan looked like someone had let the air out of him gradually over several months. He was wearing a jacket I'd seen before, a good jacket, well made, but showing the kind of wear that comes from being reached for more often than the wardrobe it used to anchor still existed. His hair needed cutting. His posture, which had always been easy and unbothered in the particular way of people who have never had cause to doubt their position in a room, was different. He walked like someone being careful about where he put his feet. Vanessa was harder to read. She had always been harder to read, which I had mistaken early on for depth. I understood now that it was something different, not depth, but the absence of transparency. She was composed, dressed appropriately, the way she had dressed for the deposition. Her face was the face of a woman who had made calculations about this meeting and was executing against them. That calculation, the fact that she was still calculating, still managing, told me more than anything she said in the first few minutes. They sat down. Ethan looked at his hands for a moment, then at me. Vanessa looked at me directly, which was what I expected. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," Ethan said. "You asked," I said. "I came." "What did you want to say?" He glanced at Vanessa. She gave no visible signal, but something passed between them. The silent communication of people who have lived inside the same bad decision long enough to have a shorthand for it. "We're in a very difficult position," Ethan said. "The judgment, with the fees and the interest. We're not going to be able to cover the full amount from what we have. The Ashford Heights deal falling through, the legal costs, the accounts that were frozen. There's a gap, a significant gap." "I know," I said. "My attorney has the same numbers you do." "We're selling what we can," he said. "The car is listed, some other things. But even with all of that," he stopped. Then, in a voice that had the texture of something that had been practiced and had not survived contact with the actual moment, "We need your help, Mom." I let that sit in the air between us for a moment. "My help," I said. "We're facing criminal charges. If this goes to trial, the criminal trial, we could lose everything, everything that's left. And Vanessa's—" He stopped again, looked at Vanessa. She spoke for the first time. "I'm pregnant," she said. The room was very quiet for a moment. I looked at her. She held my gaze with the same directness she'd walked in with, but underneath it, just barely visible, was something I had never seen in her before. Not remorse. I want to be precise. Not guilt, which looks a certain way and feels a certain way and was not what I was seeing. What I saw was fear, the specific, unglamorous fear of a person who has run out of options and knows it. "Congratulations," I said. And I meant it. I did not mean it as a weapon, and I did not mean it as absolution. I meant it, the way you mean it, when a human fact is a human fact and has its own weight regardless of everything surrounding it. "We have nowhere to go," Ethan said. "The rental. We can't afford to keep it with what's happening to our accounts. Vanessa's parents can't take us in. Her brother is dealing with his own—" He stopped. "We don't have a lot of options." "What exactly are you asking me?" I said. He looked at me, and in that look I saw the 10-year-old who had climbed in my bed during thunderstorms and the 16-year-old who had cried at Gerald's funeral, and every version in between, layered over each other the way old photographs sometimes end up in the same drawer, each one slightly out of focus. "We're asking you to talk to the DA, to tell them, to request leniency, or to consider dropping the civil debt, or some part of it. I'm not asking you to pretend this didn't happen. I know what I did. I know." He swallowed. "I'm asking you because we have a baby coming, and I'm genuinely scared." The silence after that was the longest of the meeting. I looked at my son. I let myself look at him for a long time, the way you look at something you are trying to see clearly and completely and without the distortion of what you wish it were. I looked at Ethan Whitaker, who was 40 years old and frightened and about to be a father and who had spent 11 months planning to steal my home. Then I looked at Vanessa, who had written the email about the surgery window, and who had spent $3,000 on a dress at a party paid for with my money, and who was sitting across from me now with fear where the calculation usually lived, and who was carrying a child who had not made any of these choices and would not remember them. I thought about all of that. "I want to say something," I said, "and I need you both to hear it, not just wait for it to be over." They were quiet. Ethan nodded. "I did not bring that lawsuit because I wanted to destroy you. I brought it because you took something that was mine, and I had every right and every obligation to get it back. I don't owe you the forgiveness you're looking for. Not today, maybe not for a long time. You don't get to do what you did and then come to me 6 months later and use a pregnancy to negotiate your way back into my mercy." I paused. "That's not forgiveness. That's a transaction. And I am done being the bank." Vanessa opened her mouth. I looked at her and she closed it. "I'm not going to interfere with the DA's process," I said. "That is not in my hands, and I would not pull it back even if it were, because what you did was not only against me, it was against the law, and the law handles that separately from what I feel. I cannot help you with that." Ethan's jaw tightened. He nodded once. "What I will tell you," I continued, "is this. The baby is a human being, and whatever happens to the two of you, that baby is owed a decent start. I am not going to use the criminal process to punish a child who hasn't been born yet. I will say that to anyone who asks, including the DA's office, I will not advocate for leniency for what you did to me, but I will not allow a new life to be collateral damage if I have any say in how that's framed." The room was very still. Ethan said, Thank you, Mom." His voice had gone rough in a way I hadn't heard since he was young, since before Vanessa and the wanting and the thing he'd become. For a moment, just a moment, it sounded like my son. I felt that. I won't pretend I didn't feel it. "That's not absolution," I said. "I want you to understand that." "I know," he said. "I also want to say something to you, Vanessa." She looked at me. Something had shifted in her face during the conversation. Not softened exactly, but reorganized. The calculation had a crack in it. "You spent 7 years in my life," I said. "You came to my dinners and you asked about my garden, and you told me twice that you thought of me as the mother you never had. I believed you once. I stopped believing you, but I wanted to be wrong. I spent too long trying to be wrong about you because it was easier than facing what you were asking Ethan to become." I paused. "I'm not angry at you, Vanessa. I'm tired of you. Those are different things, and I want you to know the difference." She didn't say anything, but something moved across her face, fast and quickly controlled, that I had never seen there before. I do not know what it was. I have wondered since. "This is the last time we meet like this," I said. "Whatever the legal process does, it does. If Ethan wants to have a relationship with me after all of this is resolved, a real one, not a transactional one, that door is not permanently closed, but it has conditions that I'll decide on my own time. And you," I looked at Vanessa, "are not part of that conversation." The silence that followed was the kind that contains a great deal but has nothing left to say. Ethan stood. He didn't come around the table to hug me, which was the right decision. I was not ready for that, and he seemed to understand it. He said, "I hear you." Then he picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. Vanessa stood as well. She straightened her bag on her shoulder, and then she did something I had not expected. She said, "I'm sorry, Marlene." I looked at her. "I don't expect you to believe it," she said. "I don't expect anything, but I am." I did not tell her I believed it. I did not tell her I didn't. I simply looked at her for a moment with the clear, unglamorous honesty that I had decided some months ago was the only currency I had left in sufficient supply. And then I said, "Take care of yourself." They left. I sat alone in the community center meeting room for a while after they were gone. The coffee had gone cold, and I drank some of it anyway. Outside the window, the late afternoon light was doing something complicated with the clouds, the way March light does when it's trying to decide which season it belongs to. Ruth called that evening. She had a quality, my sister, of knowing when something significant had happened, even when I hadn't told her yet. She called and asked how I was, and I said, "I met with Ethan and Vanessa today." and she said, "Oh, Marlene," in the particular tone that means I know this was hard, and I'm not going to make it harder by asking too many questions right now. "I'm all right," I said. "Did it help, seeing them?" I thought about that. "It helped me know what I needed to know," I said. "Whether it helped in the other way, the way people mean when they talk about closure and all that, I don't know yet." "You don't have to know yet," Ruth said. "I know I don't. I just wish sometimes the not knowing felt a little less like a permanent condition." She laughed softly. "That's just being alive, honey." "I know," I said. "Doesn't make it easier." "No," she said. "It really doesn't." We talked for another 30 minutes about other things. Her garden, a television series she'd been watching, the neighbor's dog who kept ending up in her yard, the small, sustaining texture of a relationship built over a lifetime. When we hung up, I felt steadier, which was what Ruth almost always accomplished, without appearing to try. The DA's office filed formal charges 11 weeks after the trial. I found out through Diane on a Wednesday morning. The same day I had my first post-judgment meeting with the new property management company handling the return of Birchwood Drive. The timing was coincidental, and also in the way that life sometimes arranges its ironies, almost too neat. Ethan was charged with document fraud, elder financial abuse, and conspiracy to commit fraud. 3 counts. Vanessa was charged with the same 3, plus 1 additional count relating to the knowing receipt of fraudulently obtained funds. Clifton Reeves received a lesser charge related to negligent notarization, reduced significantly by his cooperation. Philip Garrett's office released a statement indicating that Ethan and Vanessa intended to contest the charges. A separate attorney, the sharp-suited younger one from the trial, had been retained for the criminal matter. I read the statement twice. I thought about Ethan in that meeting room saying, "I know what I did." I thought about Vanessa saying, "I'm sorry," and whether she had meant it and what that meant for anything. Then I called Diane and asked what my involvement in the criminal proceeding would look like. "Likely victim impact," she said, "and possibly testimony if it goes to trial rather than a plea. The DA's office will contact you directly." "All right," I said. "Marlene," a pause. "How are you holding up?" It was the same question she'd asked me in the courthouse hallway during the recess, months ago. I gave her the same answer I'd given then, because it was still true and still the only honest thing I had. "I'm all right," I said. "I'm still here." She accepted that. She was a good attorney and a decent person, and she had learned over many months when I meant what I said. I put my phone in my pocket and looked out the window of the property management office at the parking lot and the strip of sky above the building across the street, and I thought about what still here meant when you were 73 years old and had spent the past year being stripped and rebuilt by something you had not chosen. I thought about what it cost and what it returned and whether the math of it ever really balanced out. I thought about the roses at the front of the house, coming in new at the base, small and red, and entirely unaware of what the winter had been. There are things that keep growing because that is what they are built to do, and no amount of wrong timing or inadequate caretaking or bitter cold changes what they are at the root. I had always known this about plants. I was beginning to understand it, slowly and at some cost, about myself. I still had work to do. The house was not yet formally back in my hands. The criminal process was beginning, with all its slow machinery. The gap in the restitution had not been closed. The morning after this one would require the same things the morning before it had required: coffee and a list, and the decision to keep moving. But I was still here. And for now, that was enough. The key fit on a Thursday. A plain Thursday in April, the kind of morning where the light comes in sideways and everything looks a little more honest than it does the rest of the day. Diane had called the evening before to confirm that the property transfer was complete, recorded, stamped, filed, done. 4817 Birchwood Drive was back in my name. After everything, after all the months and the motel rooms and the borrowed guest room and the depositions and the courtroom and the community center meeting room and the cold coffee and the sleepless 3 o'clocks, it was back. She had mailed me the new key herself, small envelope, her firm's return address, inside just the key and a note card that said, in Diane's precise handwriting, "Yours as it always was." I stood at the front door and I put the key in the lock and I turned it and the door opened. I did not go in right away. I stood in the doorway for a moment with the April light coming through behind me and the particular smell of a house that has been other people's for a while. Not unpleasant, just different, layered over something underneath that I recognized the way you recognize a voice from another room. The house. My house. 40 years of Gerald and Ethan and pot roast on Sundays and the board that sang near the stove and the morning light through the bedroom windows that I had described to myself 100 times over the past year when I needed to remember what I was fighting for. I went in. I will not tell you it was perfect. The floors had a new scratch near the hallway. The kitchen had been repainted a color I would not have chosen. The rose wallpaper in the small bathroom, the one I had put up myself in 1994 and Gerald had complained about until the day he died and then quietly admitted he had come to love, was gone, replaced with something gray and modern and entirely without personality. But the board near the stove still sang when I stepped on it. I tested it twice, to be sure. The first week back was strange in the way of readjustments that are wanted and still not easy. I slept badly the first 2 nights, which surprised me. I had expected to sleep deeply, to feel the specific rest of restoration. Instead, I lay awake listening to the house settle. The creaks and the furnace sounds and the particular silence of a structure that knows you and that you know. And I felt, underneath the relief, the full accumulated weight of everything the year had cost. There is a version of this story, I know, that ends cleanly. The house restored, the judgment paid, the criminals punished, the wronged woman returned to her life with everything accounted for. A version where justice arrives and fits precisely into the hole that injustice made. That version is not the true one. The true version is messier and more human and has gaps in it that will not close. The restitution was paid, partially. Ethan and Vanessa had liquidated what they could. The Mercedes sold at a loss. The personal items gone through consignment, every accessible account drained to meet the judgment as closely as they could manage. The final number fell approximately $61,000 short of the full amount. Diane had explored every avenue for collection on the remainder, and the honest answer was that it was likely to remain outstanding for years, recoverable only if their financial circumstances changed significantly. $61,000 that I would probably never see. I made my peace with that. Not quickly, and not without sitting with it in the specific bitter way you sit with things that are unfair and true simultaneously. But I made my peace with it because the alternative was letting it occupy space inside me that I needed for other things. And I had learned at some cost that space was not infinite and had to be allocated deliberately. The criminal case moved on its own timeline, separate from anything I controlled. The DA's office kept Diane updated, and Diane kept me updated. But the machinery of criminal prosecution is slow, and I had stopped waiting for it to resolve before deciding how to live. Ethan and Vanessa had entered not guilty pleas. Their attorneys were negotiating. Whether it would go to trial or resolve in a plea agreement was uncertain, and I had stopped needing it to be certain before I could get up in the morning. What I knew was this: the record existed. The judgment existed. The court documents with Ethan's confirmed voice on a recording and his signed deposition answers and Dr. Sims's 47-page forensic report and Marcus Chen's 89 pages of financial analysis, all of it existed, permanently and publicly, in the county records. Whatever happened in the criminal proceeding, that record was there. My name was on it. And my name, on those documents, said, she fought back. She did not sit down. She did not accept what was done to her as something she deserved. That was worth something. I'm still deciding exactly how much, but it was worth something. Carol came for dinner on my 3rd week back. She brought a bottle of wine I didn't need and a lasagna I absolutely did. And she sat at my kitchen table for 3 hours, and we talked about things that had nothing to do with lawsuits or depositions or forensic accounting. And at some point in the middle of it, I looked across the table at her and thought about the morning she had crossed the street to tell me something she didn't want to tell me, and had done it anyway because she thought I should know, about the guest room with the yellow walls and the quilt, about what it means to have a neighbor who treats you like a person with a life worth accounting for. You look better, she said, at some point in the evening. You look like yourself again." "I don't know if that's all the way true yet," I said. "No," she said, "but closer." I told her about the board near the stove, how it still sang. She laughed, a real laugh, the kind that has relief in it, and said, "Of course it does. That board has been singing since 1989. It's not going to stop for some LLC from Nevada." She was right about that. So, Patricia Okafor called it on a Saturday in May with an idea. Patricia had the particular quality of people who have worked in detail-oriented professions for 30 years. She generated ideas the way other people generated small talk, efficiently and without preamble. She said, "I've been thinking about what you're going to do with the equity." The judgment, plus the property being formally returned to my name, meant my financial position was complicated but not ruined. The house was mine, unencumbered. The recovered funds, even minus the shortfall, gave me liquidity I had not had when this started. I had been thinking about what came next in the way you think about things when you're still in the middle of recovering from something, carefully, but not yet with full commitment to any particular direction. "What have you been thinking?" I said. "Marcus mentioned you talked about selling eventually, downsizing." I had thought about it before all of this. "The market is reasonable right now for this neighborhood," she said. "You could sell, take the equity, buy something smaller with no mortgage, use the difference for whatever you want." A pause. "What do you want, Marlene?" It was the right question at the right time, asked by someone who actually wanted the answer. I sat with it for a moment. "I want something that lasts," I said. "Something that doesn't depend on anyone else's honesty to survive." "That's a good want," Patricia said. "What does it look like, practically?" "I've been reading about community land trusts," I said. "Organizations that hold property in trust for affordable housing. Seniors, mostly, in this county. People who get pushed out when the market moves or when families do what families sometimes do." I paused. "I've been thinking about establishing a small fund. Not enormous. I'm not a wealthy woman. But something that could help 2 or 3 families at a time, something that makes the kind of loss I almost had a little less likely for someone else." Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's a very you thing to want." "Is it?" "You spent 31 years in medical billing making sure other people's paperwork was right so they didn't lose things they were owed," she said. "Yes, it's very you." I looked out the kitchen window. The rose bushes on the left side of the porch were coming in properly now. I had cut them back the right way, the second week I was home, and new growth was everywhere. The small, dense clusters of leaves that meant the roots were solid, and the season was turning, and things were moving in the direction of bloom. "Then let's figure out how to do it," I said. Tick. I sold Birchwood Drive in July. Not because I had to. Because I chose to. There's a significant difference between those two things, and I want to be precise about it. I chose to sell it. I chose to take the life I had built inside those walls and carry it somewhere else, because I had learned, at a cost I would not recommend, that a home is not the building. A home is not the paid-off mortgage, or the property tax records, or the 40 years of accumulated equity. A home is the version of yourself you choose to protect and sustain inside whatever walls you have. I knew that now. The new house was smaller, 3 bedrooms instead of 5, a yard a third of the size, a kitchen with no board that sang near the stove, but a window over the sink that looked out on a neighbor's garden and let in the morning light in a way I liked from the first day. It was on a quiet street in a part of Claremont I had always driven through and thought, people live well here, modestly, but well. I paid cash. There's a specific feeling that comes with paying cash for a home after everything that happened. Not triumphant, exactly, but solid. Like finally standing on ground that cannot be pulled from underneath you because you own it outright, and the paperwork is perfect, and the signature on every document is unambiguously yours. I stood in the empty living room on the closing day and breathed and let myself feel that solidity and did not take it for granted because I had learned what it cost to lose it. The Whitaker Holloway Senior Housing Fund was established in September of that year through a partnership with a community land trust called Claremont Home Foundation that had been doing the work quietly for 11 years. I put in the first contribution myself, a portion of the Birchwood equity that I had set aside specifically for this from the moment Patricia and I had talked on that Saturday in May. It was not a large fund by any measure that would impress anyone in finance, but it was real, and it was structured, and it was mine in the way that things you build for other people always end up being yours in the deepest sense. I named it after Gerald, Whitaker for him, Holloway for my mother's maiden name. Two people who had spent their lives building things for others without expecting the credit. The first family the fund helped was a woman named Frances, 71 years old, whose daughter-in-law had been pressuring her to sign over her house for 3 years. Frances had not signed. She had just needed help understanding what her rights were and what resources existed to protect them, and she had needed that help from someone who was not trying to sell her anything. I met with her once at a coffee shop near the Foundation's office. She was a small woman with careful eyes who reminded me a little of my mother and a little of myself and a little of every woman I have ever known who built something quietly and then had to defend it from people who thought quiet meant weak. I told her what I told everyone the Foundation sent to me, which was this: you have the right to what you built, the right to stay, the right to say no, the right to take up space in your own life without apologizing for it. Those rights do not expire when you get older. If anything, you've earned them more completely than you ever have. She listened with the particular attention of someone hearing a thing they already knew but needed to hear said out loud by another person. "What do you do?" she asked, "when the people pressuring you are the people you love?" I looked at her across the coffee shop table, and I thought about the answer for a real moment before I gave it. "You love them the right way," I said, "which sometimes means you love them without giving them what they're asking for. Love is not a transaction. It doesn't work like a bank account where they can withdraw from you in proportion to what they've deposited. If someone is demanding that you prove your love by surrendering your security, what they're describing is not love. They may believe it is, but it isn't." She nodded, slowly, the way you nod when something rearranges something inside you. "And if loving them the right way means they're angry with you?" she said. "Then they're angry," I said. "You survive their anger. What you may not survive is what happens if you don't hold the line." Well, I want to talk to you directly now, not as Marlene, narrator of her own story. As a person who went through something and came out the other side still standing and still herself, talking to you. Whoever you are, wherever you are, watching this in whatever city you live in, that I will never know but that you'll write in the comments below if you've stayed with me this long. I want to say something about what this year taught me, because I think that is the obligation of anyone who survives something, to carry the meaning of it forward in a way that is useful to someone else. The first thing I learned is this: people who want to take from you will always find a reason that sounds like love. They will call it family. They will call it practicality. They will call it what's best for you, what you'd want, what you agreed to in some conversation they remember differently than you do. And because we have been taught, most of us, especially women who are older, especially women who have spent their lives being useful to people they love, we have been taught that love means giving, and that refusing to give means you are withholding something you owe. We are vulnerable to that framing. We feel guilty for having needs. We feel selfish for having things. We feel, at some level, that what we built only counts if we are willing to give it away. That is a lie. And it is a lie that costs people everything, every day, in ways that don't always end up in a courtroom. The second thing I learned is that anger is not the same as strength, and patience is not the same as weakness. I was patient for 11 months while the legal case built itself. People in my life, people who cared about me, sometimes interpreted that patience as passivity, as suffering, as a woman who had been broken. What it actually was a woman who understood that the most powerful thing she could do was wait until she was ready and then move without hesitation. Patience in service of a clear goal is not passivity, it is strategy. Do not let anyone take your deliberateness from you and call it defeat. The third thing, and this is the one I come back to most often, in the quiet of the new house, in the mornings when the light comes through the kitchen window and the neighbor's garden is doing what gardens do, is that what was done to me was not, in the end, about the house. The house was the object of the crime. But the crime itself was about the belief that I had become disposable, that I was old enough, quiet enough, recovering from surgery enough, trusting enough that I could be set aside, that what I had built and what I was and what I still had left to do could be folded up and put away without consequence. That belief was wrong. I am 73 years old and I am not done. I run a housing fund that has helped 4 families in its first year. I have a small yard with a garden that I am learning, slowly, to make mine. I have Ruth, who calls every Sunday without exception. I have Carol across town, and Patricia with her efficient ideas, and Diane Howell, who sent me a new key with a note card that said, "Yours," as it always was. I have a son who is somewhere in the middle of consequences he created, who is going to be a father, who said I know what I did in a conference room in a voice that sounded, briefly, like the boy I raised. I do not know what we will be to each other. I know the door is not permanently sealed. I know that love, even love that has been used against you and distorted and weaponized, does not simply stop. It changes shape. It becomes something smaller and more cautious, and surrounded by conditions that were not there before. But it does not simply stop. That is not a resolution. I want to be honest with you about that. There is no clean ending to the story of a parent and a child who have been where Ethan and I have been. There is only the ongoing negotiation between what was done and what, if anything, can be built from what remains. I am not there yet. I may not be there for a long time, but I am still here. And I have learned, at a price I would not choose to pay again, but that I would not trade for the ignorance it replaced, that still here is not nothing. Still here, with your name on your own home, and your wits intact and your sense of who you are uncollapsed. Still here, after someone tried to make you invisible and found out they were wrong, is in fact everything. The morning after I moved into the new house, I went to the kitchen window and looked out at the neighbor's garden. It was early, the light was sideways and honest the way April light is, and there were roses in the far corner of their yard, not my roses, someone else's roses, tended by someone else's hands, and they were just beginning to open. I made coffee. I drank it at the window. I watched the roses and I thought about what Gerald used to say, that I was the kind of woman who helped people find their way home. And I thought about Francis and the families the fund had helped, and the ones it would help next year, and the year after that. I thought, this is what I am for now. This is the version of my life that the worst year of it made room for. And I stood at that window in the early light of my own kitchen in my own house that no one could take. And I felt, for the first time in a very long time, something I can only describe as complete. Not perfect, not painless, but complete. If you are watching this right now, and you are someone who has been made to feel that what you built is someone else's to take, I want you to hear me. You are not too old, you are not too quiet, you are not too trusting or too loving or too soft to fight for what is yours. The fact that you loved the person who wronged you does not mean you deserved what they did. It means you were generous with something precious, and they were not careful with it, and that is their failure, not yours. Protect yourself. Know what you own and put it in writing and review it every year, and do not wait until someone is already at the door. Find a Diane Howell before you need one. Find a Patricia, a Carol, a Ruth. People who know your name and will tell you the truth, and will sit with you in borrowed rooms and terrible motels and courthouse hallways, and still be there when the key finally turns. And if someone tries to tell you that holding on to what is yours is selfish, if they try to use love as the reason you should surrender your security, ask them this question and listen very carefully to how they answer it. If you loved me, why would you need me to have nothing? The answers to that question will tell you everything you need to know. My name is Marlene Whitaker. I am 73 years old. I lost my house and I got it back, and then I chose something better. I am still here, still standing, and I am done being underestimated. Thank you for staying with me to the end.